Hi, Misha here, and got another Eaglemoss, and this one's actually from the smaller scale. The little ships they started off the Star Trek Starships collection with, that are roughly 3.5 to 5.5 inches die-cast. And though the collection officially ended with issue 180, they continue to do bonus editions, and they're into the 30s of those. And the most recent bonus edition actually really excited me when they announced it, and for once it actually was announced and came out quite quickly. The Klingon D5, and we've had this D5 before, the battle cruiser. This was pretty early in the collection, at least halfway through. This is the D5 tanker. And at first, it might just seem like they put tanks on the bottom. But actually, there are major differences from the studio models between the two. And I was curious to see how closely Eaglemoss would kind of replicate this. And the tanker we actually saw before the battlecruiser. We saw it in an episode called Marauders of Enterprise, Season 2. And it wasn't until, I believe, Judgment, later on, we encountered this one. And this was very nearly the first Klingon ship we saw. It was really the first one we saw active, because the Raptor, Scout, was not really doing a whole lot in that episode, Sleeping Dogs. So, let's dig into the model a bit. Talk about how these are actually quite a bit different. Talk about it real world and in universe. Let's begin with the D5 battle cruiser on the spinny thing. And a side canon, beta canon, has it that the D stands for Devastator. And this is a series, of course, in the real world that began with the D7 from the original series. And the D name has kind of popped up here and there. For example, D12 in Star Trek Generations. This seems to be the main battle line. And we know of the D4. We have what I consider to be the D6. And the D7 has appeared in more recent shows like Discovery. This is your traditional Klingon battlecruiser. In universe, it's about 210 meters long, about 157 meters wide because of the wings, but less than 50 meters tall, pretty thin. In fact, kind of abnormally thin for a Klingon ship. It does have kind of an avian design going on, not quite to the extent of a Romulan, but it's there. Crew's hard to estimate, between 100 and 350, and well, the Klingons do like packing crew in. I will give them that. More importantly, it has 4 heavy disruptors, 2 mounted on the neck area, and then 2 more in a bottom mount that is often referred to as a turret, but may not be. And it is, well, armored as well. By the way, it does have photon torpedoes, at least one launcher firing forward. It has a kind of a dispersive armor. It's said to be bonded monocrystal. And it does have early versions of shields, although they don't seem to be the strongest in the world if a phase cannon could punch through them. It is faster than the Enterprise in X01 at about warp 6, although of course it would cruise at about warp 4. And its bridge is quite compact because Klingons, in fact, it only has 3 seated stations plus standing stations, consoles, workstations for more if needed. And the bridge is quite well armored and protected. And a lot of the engineering's in the back. We have impulse drives, a small shuttle bay, and of course RNA cells for warp. Pretty standard. And it has kind of this rigging pattern going on, which is something that John Eaves and others kind of started for the Enterprise Klingon era, which gives them a certain retro aesthetic and identifiable, as are kind of these hollowed out nacelles. So we've heard of the D5 reference all the way back in the animated series, and again in Deep Space Nine, and it was referred to as an old ship by the 24th century. But when Enterprise is taking place in the 2150s, this is a new ship. It was launched around 2146, 2147, and along with the D4 and smaller craft is kind of the bulk of the Klingon fleet. These are used for patrol, battle, orbital bombardment, and even flagships for admirals. They seem to be reasonably well appointed for a Klingon ship. So this is the first model we've had, and it's quite nice. The front's metal, the wings and nacelles are plastic, and it was one that I was very happy they put in the collection, and one of the many reasons I got into it. But we saw the tanker first, and this is referred to as a D5 tanker, but it's really not. I think they're just using the name D5 because lack of a better thing. This is captained in the show by Korok, which is a, marauder, Klingon raider, who is strong-arming deuterium, which is actually an isotope. It's a heavy hydrogen, stable, and it's been featured in Star Trek shows for quite a while, from miners on a planet. And this would seem to be not a warship. For one thing, it is smaller, 155 meters long, so, roughly 3/4 the size of the battle cruiser. It also lacks the heavy disruptors, at least the two underbelly ones. It may have two standard ones. I'm not sure if it has photon torpedoes or not. But in the weapons place, it has 8 deuterium tanks, 4 on each side, which can hold approximately 80,000 liters all told. So about roughly 10,000 liters per tank. It also has a much smaller crew of only 12, at least in the show, and can even be operated by as few as 4. Kind of reminds me in principle of kind of like the Malon export vessel, the garbage scow. And it's a little slower, max speed of right around warp 5, with a cruise in the around like 3.5 to 3.8. So, slower. I don't know if it has shielding. Probably, maybe not, because the Raptor didn't. But it does seem to have some armor and defensive capabilities. Of course, none of these would have cloak. This is long before the Klingons had cloak. Discovery, pay attention. And of course, this was not a good guy ship. And I was actually very happy to get this. One thing, I just kind of like the design. For another, it basically now gives us all of the Klingon ships from Enterprise. Enterprise as a show gave us more Klingon ships than really anyone else. As often as the Klingons were featured in Deep Space Nine and the wars, they pretty much stuck to the bird of prey, with occasional appearances by the Katinga and Vorcha, and occasionally the Negvar. So it was nice to finally get a fleet. And fleets need tankers. And, here we go. So like I said at the beginning, people might just think this is a D5 with tanks mounted, but it's really not. It's also a heavier model than the D5. Seems like it has more weight in the neck, maybe even more in the wings, but certainly in the neck. So let's begin comparing them. So side by side on the spinny thing, top view. The nacelles may look smaller on the cruiser versus the tanker, but that's actually just because of the relative size of the models. And in the physical models, they're bigger on the tanker. But I actually think this is meant to represent this being a fourth larger, 65 meters give or take, than this. So if they're using roughly the same type of nacelle, it would be smaller on the battlecruiser. Looking further, the wings are actually very different shaped from the root where it joins the neck and body all the way out here. There's a little bit of piping on the back. On this wing, it's more zigzaggy, curvy, and this area appears quite a bit different. There also seems to be more rigging going on with the battlecruiser. And in fact, the whole neck of the battlecruiser is stretched out compared to the tanker. It's not just that the tanks make it look stubbier. And the heads are different. The head here is a little bit shorter. This one's a little more stretched out. You can really tell by feeling them. And while as the tanker has windows on the head, the battlecruiser, they deleted them from the studio model to give a larger sense of scale, and also probably just to make it feel more of a battleship type. So kind of a different wing arrangement, different neck, different head, and the kind of size and placement of the nacelles is slightly different because of the wings. Of course, at the bottom, the differences are even clearer. So here we are upside down. You can see the tanker has tanks and does not have any armament on the ventral side there. And the battlecruiser does. Now this is often credited as a turret. It's almost more like an old school casemate. They certainly can move, but it would seem to be more like they move vertically from firing forward to firing down. And I think kind of an interesting thought is in the name, Devastator. If you wanted to do a planetary bombardment, you would want to be in orbit and fire down. Obviously, you could also fire down on ships, but I don't think the fact that it may not rotate 360 degrees is an impediment. It can fire forward, it can fire down, and maybe it could flip all the way around and fire rear. That'd kind of be nice for them too. That's all gone for the tanker. And since they have to make provisions for the tanks and all that, the bottoms are very, very different, which is kind of funny. Usually with models, especially seems like CGI, the bottom is the neglected part. It's the top they tend to focus on. So really, the area they're most alike is the engineering section, the rear part, the kind of the step up there, the heads, the bottoms, even the nacelles are pretty different. So I have to say, I think Eaglemoss really did catch on here. And I have to say that's one of Eaglemoss's strengths. They very rarely take the lazy route. They could have very easily just had this mold and modified it this, especially for a bonus edition. But looking at the stand, the clips here are much thinner than the ones here, meaning this whole area, the wing, is thicker on the tanker, because again, we're kind of zooming in. It's a larger scale, if you were, because in the reality, holding them, they're about the same size. And they were good about this when we did all the Miranda variants. You'd think they would just take the same Miranda mold and add a roll bar, subtract a sensor pod, but they rarely do that. In fact, the biggest I can think of was with the Cage Enterprise, which is another bonus edition. They went to the trouble of the large deflector and the more or less correct nacelles, but they did not put the larger bridge module on. So once in a while you'll catch them, especially with some of the XLs. But it seems like, with the exception of the Negvar, they put a lot of attention and detail into their Klingon ships, including their birds of prey. I think the Vorcha is a fan favorite. And I really like their Enterprise ships because very, very few companies have done these, even fewer in diecast. And I don't mind them being of a small size. For a hero ship, it's kind of nice to have a 7, 8, 9-inch model. But for just kind of a background ship, especially one like the tanker, having something a little more affordable, not so bad. So I wanted to give an in-depth review, and also credit to the people at Star Trek Enterprise 20 years ago. They did not just take this and slightly modify it into this. It actually is pretty well changed. And let's be honest, the Klingons have a long-standing history of scaling things up. Just look at the Bird of Prey. My goodness, there's 2, 3, maybe even 4 different sizes on screen. So, kind of in the grand tradition. Go small for a freighter, and go larger for a battlecruiser. Very Klingon. So, again, I was very happy when this one joined the collection years ago. And I was actually quite very, very happy when this one was announced. And actually, it came in nearly on time. It was scheduled for April, and it came in early May. In fact, you could say it shipped out right at the end of April, so they were pretty on with it. So what do you think of either the Enterprise Klingon ships in general, or these specifically? Let me know, and I appreciate you hanging out. If you could, do please like, share, subscribe, all that fun good stuff. And now for me, it's getting back to work time.